Friends, thank you very much for joining us again. Great to see you. James, great to see you too.
And also with you.
Thank you for that excellent liturgical response.
Very good to see you, Ian. Yeah.
And speaking of liturgical responses, we have sort of 4 liturgical responses that we invite our
We
viewers to do. Do we
not?
not? Do they have to do them in a particular order, I wonder?
I don't know. We may change the order at times. I don't know. We normally say please subscribe first.
Oh, I thought we said like first.
Oh, do we? Okay. Well,
I don't know, because I always do a thumbs up.
Right. Okay. So please subscribe. And then do like the videos if you.
And then like, subscribe,
really
and then
helpful.
like.
Yeah. Do share on the social media and do comment.
Yes. So we had quite a few comments last week. I've replied to many of them, I think.
Yeah.
So, and James, you need to get in there with your replies as well.
I do. I should probably. Yeah. I don't spend all my time reading the YouTube channel in, but of course I, would like to.
Thank you. I'll take that little snub and duck. Well, okay, James, since you're not spending time on the YouTube channel, but busy with other things, tell us where we are in the lectionary and why it's important here.
Right. So this will be Lent 4.
It is. Will be. It is Lent 4. Yeah, fine. Yeah.
Yep.
And we're in a little mini sequence in the 4th Gospel, aren't we?
We are in a little mini sequence in the 4th Gospel, and this is the penultimate one. I think the next one after this is the man.
Yeah, you can just say third of 4, James. You don't need to use a fancy technical word, but penultimate. Last week's was the pre-penultimate, but you didn't say that.
No, I didn't. Well, I don't go that far with technical words.
Okay.
Yeah. So we're on Luke chapter 9. And
John chapter 9.
Sorry, John chapter 9. Why did I say Luke? John chapter 9, verses 1 to 41. The man born blind, and I think this actually might even be longer than the passage last week of the woman of Samaria.
Which we said last week we thought it was one of the longest. Readings,
this so one's here we get another massively long reading.
Next week is going to be longer still.
Lazarus, yeah.
So Lazarus, indeed.
Yeah. But I mean, let's affirm the lectionary on this one. We do get the whole story.
We do
in its entirety. No chopping. So we should say thank you for that.
Yeah. Now, on the fact of the whole story, it does mean that this week, unless we spend hours and hours and hours, we're not going to be able to comment verse by verse. We're going to comment sort of section by section. But just a couple of things to observe is that, and I think it takes a while to recognize that in these stories as you read them, that they are incredibly lifelike dramas. So when I used to teach this in theological college, I actually simply printed out the text and I gave it to students, and then we actually enacted it. They literally read the parts, which is fascinating. And in fact, a number of commentators about the woman of Samaria in John by the well in John 4, a number of commentators, we didn't explore this very much, but they also said that this reads like a sort of drama script. It's ready to be enacted. And there's two sort of large scale elements of that, and I've discussed this previously it's in the written blog as well. One is, now I'm careful to use this technical term, the shape of the story is chiastic.
Yeah, it is.
Now, for viewers who don't like technical terms like chiastic, what that means is that the first and the last parts correspond. The second and the second to last parts correspond, and then the third and the third to last parts correspond. And it means that there's a sort of a hinge bit in the middle. And in fact, the structure is that at the beginning you have Jesus' disciples and the blind man. At the end, you have Jesus' encounter with the Pharisees. You've got the man and his neighbors. You've got Jesus and the man. You've got the man and the Pharisees. And in the middle, you've got the Jews, the Judeans, the Judai, and the man's parents with this confrontation. But it gives the whole narrative a particular shape to it, a very satisfying sort of dramatic shape.
It does, and very often in this particular kind of chiasm, the central section is as you say, the hinge, and it points us to what is essentially the substantial theme that the author is wanting us to draw on. And I think that becomes, and we look at that obviously when we get there, but it does become very clear.
Yeah. The other thing, which going back on my previous writing on this, which I've completely forgotten actually, is that the narrative, I say this, the narrative makes extensive use of sticomythia.
Yes, what a lovely word that is. And you accused me of using technical terms.
Sorry about that. It's a dramatic technique originating in Greek drama, but continue to use in plays and films today. All these ancient rhetorical techniques, they're all, they carry on because they're not artificial constructions. They're simply observations about, what works well, what makes for good and persuasive speech. Now, this quality is one where different characters recite alternate lines, but very often in tension and contradiction to one another. Yeah. And that creates this real sense of conflict and tension, pulling one way and the other between the different characters, and it heightens this sense of tension and conflict, particularly we find between Jesus and the Pharisees, well, but also between the man and the Pharisees. And there's some lovely little example of that as the narrative goes on, aren't there?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's I think it probably is the liveliest conversation in the gospel. Yeah. And as you say, it's a sort of rip-roaring read, but it's also profoundly dramatic, and the scenes are quite well defined, aren't they?
They are.
So you kind of, if you were watching it as a play, you would know that, okay, it's sort of Act 1, Scene 1, and then Act 1, Scene 2, and so on, and it's very, very clear.
Yeah. So let's go into the first section of this, which sort of goes from verse 1 to verse 7. Although there's two little bits within it, aren't there? Now, one thing that really struck me about this, looking at it again, is that this is quite unusual, and it actually looks quite synoptic in this sense that mostly in the fourth gospel, it's Jesus and Jesus alone. So he was alone with the woman at the well. He was alone with Nicodemus, or at least he might not have been alone, but he's alone in the drama, in the sense that the focus is just on Jesus and this person. Whereas here, as we quite often find in the synoptics, it's the disciples who raise a question, or the disciples who set the scene, as it were. So this is quite striking, isn't it?
It is, and it feels like a piece of his public ministry, as it were. But also, and of course, as we discover the Jews and the Pharisees and everybody involved in this, but it's also an opportunity to teach his disciples, or for the disciple to learn something, or indeed here for the disciples actually to play a part in the drama, which is not entirely positive, but it's there.
No, blessing the disciples don't always get a good write-up, do they? Which just incidentally is one of the things that we keep coming back to when people say, very skeptically, oh, well, this is all made up. This is made up by the early church, or this is a fabrication. I just want to say, if the Gospels were a fabrication, if I was one of the disciples fabricating it, I would surely paint myself in a better light.
Yes, I think I'd be really annoyed at the write of the fourth Gospel.
Yeah, quite. Unless, of course, here's the possible scenario, is that the early church make up these stories about Jesus and disciples, and then they say to themselves, I'm sure some skeptic in the future will say it's made up, so I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll paint ourselves in a really poor light so that it's an argument against the idea that we've made this up.
Yes, it just becomes.
I think that's unlikely.
It's like learning 16 impossible, believing 16 impossible things before breakfast.
No, indeed. But of course, the question they ask is actually a perennial one, isn't it? Which is, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Now, behind that, there is a question about how do we respond when bad things happen to, well, good people, just people. Yeah.
And what's particularly interesting, I think, here is that the Jesus doesn't really answer the question, does he? What he does do, as so often, is that he refocuses our attention, the attention of those standing around him, not necessarily on the reasons for things, but what God is up to in this man and in the future. And as it turns out, this man has an enormous amount going for him in Jesus's terms. And I think ultimately he becomes the prime example of a disciple. So, that's really quite a different, and he's also, I think he's the liveliest character in John's gospel. To be honest, I really like him.
He's feisty. He is
feisty. Yeah.
He's even more feisty than the woman at the well.
Yeah, absolutely, he is.
So we also have a sort of big sense of progression, haven't we? Interestingly, last week on last week's discussion, one or two people online observed this, that you have these encounters, and actually there is a sense of progression. Well, there's a liveliness, but there's also a sense of progression towards discipleship and faith as we encounter these characters through.
Yes, and indeed even to resurrection for Lazarus. So so it's a very, I think that was a really helpful comment. Yeah.
And of course the ultimate end of that development is when the writer of the gospel says, and these things are written that you might believe.
Yeah.
So the ultimate person is the final reader, and saying, what's your response going to be?
Yeah.
Two interesting things about Jesus's response. Just one is from a literary point of view, that we have oh gosh, we're into technical terms here today, aren't we? I was going to say analepsis and prolepsis. That's just a fancy language for saying it's connecting with what we've seen before, because of course the language of light and darkness, and that goes all the way back to chapter 1.
Yeah.
But also prolepsis, looking ahead. When it says in verse 4, Jesus says, "Night is coming," and of course, when does that happen? The answer is chapter 13. Judas goes out, and it was not night. So there we know when the night is coming.
I mean, there's a good question there, though, isn't there? In night is coming. I mean, is that just the night of John's, of John's gospel, in the sense that from that 13 until the day of resurrection, or is it the night of darkness before the final great day of resurrection, which we're still waiting? So, well, are we still in the darkness, but trying to live as people of light, or has that light, in the scheme of the writer of the fourth gospel, how do you think that works?
Well, I want to say, James, it's both hands, isn't it? I mean, yes. in a sense, using a quite different register of language in John 16, where Jesus says, "In this world you will have tribulation, but take heart, I've overcome the world." So it's part of that partial realization of the kingdom, isn't it? That we live in the kingdom light, but we continue to do that in a dark world. So
I'm sure that's right. Yeah.
But there's another interesting thing, which I know that you've been quite struck by, where Jesus says, "We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day." And initially it looks as though the works that Jesus wants to do is the work of healing and restoration of this man.
Yeah.
But the man's response actually adds another dimension to that as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. I mean, I think J. Ramsey Michaels points this out in his commentary on John, that there's quite an interesting parallel with the story of Nicodemus in 3:21, where Jesus says, "Whoever does the truth comes to the light, so that his works will be revealed."
Yeah.
And of course, in that context, the works are the works of the person who comes to the light. So the question here about, God's works, or the works of God, are they the works of God of the blind man, or are they the works of God of Jesus? Well, I think clearly in the context there's a sense in which the works of God is the work that Jesus is about to do in this man. But I wonder also that whether actually because it's the works of the man as well, almost, that he actually becomes the prime example of discipleship, because that's what the light does. It reveals something really important, and that's what light always does. It both reveals what is good, but also brings about a greater contrast with darkness, doesn't it?
And we see through the story, as the man simply testifies, tells his story, it provokes a reaction in the different people who hear him. So it exposes what their attitude is.
Absolutely. It's relentless. Yeah.
I love the fourth gospel seems to have a thing with dirt on the ground, doesn't it? Because Jesus writes in the dust on the ground in chapter 8. Well, that may or may not be actually part of the original text. But he spits on the ground and makes mud with the saliva. And again, you kind of think, well, what's the point of that? And the answer is, well, I just think it happened. There doesn't seem to be any symbolic significance to this, really.
No.
Although people might go on to comment and say, "Oh, they think it does." But it's interesting again that the fourth gospel, again, we think of it as a spiritual gospel. It's actually a gospel with spit and sawdust, almost literally.
Absolutely. And I love that in verse 7, where he says, "Go wash in the pool of Siloam," and then the writer says, which means sent. Kind of pointing out his own pun, almost. Really.
No, indeed.
Really, you should never mention not meant to explain your own jokes, but in a sense, it does explain his own joke. So I rather like that. He's sent to the pool of scent.
And again, there is a tradition in critical scholarship which says, well, there you go, that shows that the gospel writer is creative and using symbolism and all that kind of stuff. And I want to ask, well, why don't we allow Jesus to be like that? Why can't it have been Jesus who made the pun?
Yeah, and I think both of us have been to the pool of Siloam, and
we have.
It's a pool in Jerusalem.
It is.
It's not some made up idea. It's
no.
It's a proper place.
And
of course, it also echoes. I think probably echoes anyway the story of Naaman, doesn't it? Where he has to wash in the Jordan. So there's that kind of continuity, that echo that's going on there.
And there's it's the sort of stuffness of the wonder, isn't it? The miracles happen in the nitty-gritty of earthly life.
This kind of detail is what actually helps you just kind of realize this is a absolutely historical story.
It's a compelling story, isn't it?
It's a very compelling story. Yeah.
Now, the next section, which is, it's got less sort of theological meat in it, but it is quite interesting. The neighbors, and those who'd seen him before, there's a bit of a dispute. Is it him? Is it the one we saw?
Yes.
No, it's like him. I mean, which is feels a bit odd, doesn't it?
It does feel a little bit odd, and yet I think there is a connection. It's not the only time in John's Gospel where this happens, or in the fourth Gospel where this happens. It happens also, of course, on the day of resurrection with Mary Magdalene not recognizing Jesus.
Yeah.
So I wonder if there's something here about, this man has been healed of his blindness. Something of the new creation has entered into his life through that. And Jesus, of course, is on the first day of the new creation in the garden. So there's a continuity, but there's a discontinuity sufficient to mean that some people are changed, even if they're the same person, and one needs to reestablish kind of contact. So that's interesting, isn't it?
It is. And I have heard stories about people who come to faith, and when people see them, they say, "You look different."
Yeah, yeah, and
something changes about you.
Absolutely. And I remember when I had a very profound experience of the Holy Spirit when I was 22. And it was on a Saturday night, and the next morning I walked into church, and my girlfriend came up to me and said, "Okay, what's happened to you?"
Wow.
She didn't know anything about it, but she could see something had happened.
Gosh,
and that was her first words to me, which is extraordinary. And other people did as well. So there was something there is something goes on, isn't there?
Yeah, there is. And then again, what's interesting in this little section is that they say what has happened, and he simply tells his story. I mean, it is fascinating, isn't it? We think that testimony or testifying or bearing witness is complicated, but he just simply, this is part of the humor of the passage, because several times people say, well, what's happened? He went, this man spit, he put mud in my eyes, I washed and I'm healed. I mean, what more can you say?
Yes, it's kind of almost staccato sentence, isn't it? Isn't it? Very, very brief. No flanneling.
And then we see again this sort of backwards and forwards contrast. Where is he? I do not know. So and then we get into the next section. So they bring the man. So this is section sort of 3, isn't it? They bring the man to the Pharisees, and we get in verse 14, of course, the note that we find again. It's not unknown in the fourth gospel. It's quite common in the synoptics. I'm thinking particularly, for instance, of the woman bent over in Luke 18. Jesus heals, and it happened on the Sabbath. Again, the Pharisees asked him, so what had happened? So then he tells his story again.
I love the irony. They just uses their questioning as a relentless opportunity to give testimony, which is just winding them up. It's just,
In the next section, we've got now again the language of the Jews, and there's an issue here about they're in Jerusalem. So is this should we read this as Jews? Should we read it as Judeans, that is people in the south, or is it about the Jewish leaders? And this seems to be the sort of hinge passage, doesn't it? The central section. So it's the encounter between the southerners, the Jewish leaders, and the man's parents. And there's some more ambiguities that open up in this section, aren't there?
Yeah, I think there are, because there's this whole question about whether his parents are prepared to give testimony. Are they prepared to stand and speak of what they know to be true?
Yes.
And actually they turn out to be slightly evasive. Well, he's of age, go and ask him is a way of not saying. And of course that challenge to all of us about, will we speak of Christ for ourselves or not? So that does seem to be I think this is the hinge. It is about testimony, and it's also about what happens when you give testimony, is ultimately this story. So I do think it's central and pivotal.
There's also a dynamic, I wonder, here as well, about those who are not the ones who themselves encounter Jesus, but as it were the bystanders or the observers.
Yes.
And it's about creating this sense of a group who are undecided, and then sort of, as it were, within the narrative, pressing the question of decision. So there's no doubt that the man himself, where he's at and what his testimony is, and then it's about saying, well, okay, you're standing on the side here. You've seen what's happened. You know what's going on. What's your response? What are you going to do about it? So it is actually provoking this sense of, okay, if you're the bystander, are you going to get involved? Are you going to get drawn in, or are you actually going to step away?
Yeah, and once again, there's a little sort of link there with the end of the fourth gospel, where blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe. Oh, yeah. I mean, these people are not the man in whom this miracle has taken place, but that doesn't mean that they shouldn't believe. And in fact, blessed are they if they do believe because of him, even though what's happened in him is not what's happened in them. So there is a really important idea here in the fourth gospel, that you should be believing, well, yes, there's an opportunity to believe because of others' testimony.
Well, and that also connects with Jesus' prayer in John 17, where he prays, I pray not only for them, but those who will believe through the message that they pass on. So
because again, it's the message and the power of the message, isn't it? That's
it is
central. Yeah.
Now, in verse 22, we have a typical, again, Johannine sort of motif, which is in English translations is put in brackets because it is a parenthetical statement. So it's going back and sort of explaining it, giving a little background knowledge. And we've seen this in the fourth gospel time and time again. His parents said these things because they feared the Jews. So again, we get that motif of fear, quote unquote, of the Jews. So we see that in the locked rooms in John 20 when the risen Jesus comes to them. I think this is also a point, and most commentators will highlight this, where you're getting the application of the story to the next generation. Put it in with the story, because anyone who was to confess Jesus to be the Christ would be put out of the synagogue. So you've got almost there a kind of technical term for expulsion. So in looking back and recounting this narrative, the writer is actually anticipating what's already happening in the world of the writer, sort of one generation later, with the divide between the Jews who don't believe and the Jews who do believe. Really important that we hold on to this fight. This isn't Christians versus Jews. This is believing Jews versus unbelieving Jews. And also there's a more greater complexity. This Mark Stibbe points this out as well within the narrative. There's also a group in the previous chapter 8, of Jews who had believed but had fallen away. And we know that because in John 6, many of the Jews who believed in him said, this teaching is too hard, and they fell away. So actually there is that quite nuanced dynamic of what's going on in relation to the testimony about Jesus.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we go back, and now we're sort of replaying the structure, aren't we? Because the next episode from verse 24, this is the Pharisees who meet the man again for a second time.
And they say, give glory to God, which is a kind of way of saying, it's kind of a way of saying, tell the truth.
It is, but it's wonderfully ironic, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. No,
because they want him to glorify God by saying Jesus hadn't done anything, when of course he glorifies God by saying exactly what Jesus has done.
And the irony gets really sharp in this scene, I think, doesn't it?
Yes.
That bit where he's, I don't know whether he's a sinner, but I do know this, a wonderful, straightforward testimony. And then I think the best line in the whole of the fourth gospel, I really love this. Do you also want to become his disciples? You can just hear the tone of voice of this wonderful man, can't you? As he says that to them. And what what I think is absolutely extraordinary is his courage and testimony.
It's interesting, isn't it, that their status doesn't seem to
faze him at all. This is speaking truth to power, if ever there was any, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It is. And there's also, again, just looking at the sort of language here, in verse 30, he's actually getting quite sarcastic.
That's why you should love him.
Well, what a thing this is, We know that God does listen to sinners. Never since the beginning of the world have we ever heard of a man who's opened the eyes of the blind. And yet, if this man was not from God, he could do nothing. So, what do you say? What do you say?
Yeah. This is a passage that absolutely demands to be read well in church, doesn't it? With bringing out that, because it's absolutely there. It's lovely.
It really is. So, interesting as well that there are connections within the story. I hadn't really noticed this before, but in verse 34, they said, "You were born in utter sin, and yet you would teach us." Now, what's interesting about that is that connects back to the disciples' original question, where they say to him, "Was it this man's sin, or was it his parents' sin that caused him to be blind?" So. Some interesting connections there, and you almost wonder whether the way that the disciples have framed the question is actually correlates with the Pharisees, the Jews approach here. Sorry.
That's interesting, isn't it? Yeah.
And then we get to, within the story, we've got the whole chapter here, haven't we? It's right to the end of the chapter.
Yes.
We get something quite interesting in this last section, haven't we? Because in verse 35, Jesus heard that they'd cast him out. And when he went and found him.
Yeah, and this idea of being found by Jesus, this proactive seeking out of an individual by Jesus, is something that's happened already in the Gospels, but it's something which is, I think it's unique actually to the fourth Gospel. I don't remember it happening in the Synoptics, and being commented on. It happens with the man at the pool of Bethesda, where after he's been healed and there's been a there's been a tussle about the Sabbath, and and Jesus finds him and speaks to him, and here there's this follow-up. So it's a pastoral follow-up, really, is what we call it. But this idea about Jesus seeking out individuals is wonderful, isn't it? I mean,
it is. It is part of the mixed spiritual economy, because of course Nicodemus has gone to Jesus, and of course in chapter 12 the Greeks, you know, seek Jesus as well. So there is both hands, but this is very striking, isn't it?
Yeah.
There's also, again, quite a strong, I mean, you've already mentioned this, there's quite a strong parallel with part of the episode of the woman at Samaria, as well, the woman by the well, because whereas, you know, she says when Messiah comes, he will teach us everything, and then Jesus says, I am he who is speaking to you, and then again you get the man saying, who is he, sir, that I may believe in him? And Jesus says, you have seen him, it is he who is speaking to you. Again, very, very similar phrase there, isn't it? But a much fuller expression of belief. Lord, I believe, and he worshipped him. Oh my goodness.
Yeah, and I think that worshipping, I mean, it implies something quite physical. I think it feels physical. I mean, does he fall down at his feet?
Well, it does. The word is proskuneo, so it's which kneeling down before him. Yeah.
So it's a powerful image, isn't it?
Yes. And I think, I mean, if you comment to me that this is sort of the first time where someone actually, you know, states their belief quite explicitly, the townsfolk who respond to the woman's testimony in chapter 4 come close to that, don't they? We believe is the savior of the world. Now, what's really fascinating then is that you get, although this drama has been structured so the last part is Jesus and the man, of course, actually it looks like the Pharisees are overhearing him. Some of the Pharisees nearby heard him say these things, and then you get again a very dense set of comments, which again have this classic double meaning within the fourth gospel, but also reaching back to previous comments, this time in chapter 3 from the story of Nicodemus. For judgment I came into this world. Now that's interesting, because John 3:16 says, God so loved the world that Jesus came that everyone who believes in him may not perish. And he did not come to judge the world, and yet the judgment has already come, because anyone who does not believe has already been judged. So you've got quite a connection there and quite a strong tension between those two sayings.
And is the implication of Jesus really that you essentially judge yourself if you don't respond to him? I mean, there's something akin to that, isn't there? That the consequences are, you know, work in that way. Which is again gives us sort of an edge to the whole language of testimony. So if we do testify, if we tell our story and people don't respond, then that's kind of serious, isn't it? It is, absolutely.
So it's a good reason why. It's one of the many reasons why we're afraid to testify.
It is
anxious about it. So
and
then you get this extraordinary sort of double meaning where he says, you know, those who do not see may see, and those who see may become blind. Are we also blind? If you were blind, you would have no guilt. But now you say we see, your guilt remains. So if you have to disentangle that, it's It reminds me of Bilbo Baggins at his 111th birthday party, where he says, I know half as many as you, half as well as I should, and I like half as many of you, half as well as you deserve. And they're all sitting there going, well, I can't make out what on earth he's talking about there. So, there we go.
Yeah.
Fascinating passage. James, any tips on preaching on this passage? Have it read well.
Have it read well, and do focus on the central. You know, use that structure, that chiastic structure, and focus on that central question about testimony and belief. But I think also don't fail to bring out the glorious character of this wonderful man at the heart of it, because I think that's very winsome. Hugely
engaging, and so many practical questions to explore after that for our own faith and discipleship. James, great to chat with you. Friends, thank you so much for joining us. Don't forget to like and to subscribe and to comment and to click and share with other people. And we look forward to seeing you next time.
Indeed.
Cheers.
Yeah.